Hey, everybody. Welcome. Thank you. As she said, I'm Jim Stratton. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Workday, joined by my colleague Kelly Trindel, who is our Chief Responsible AI Officer. For those who aren't familiar, Workday, we provide enterprise software for many of the largest companies in the world for HR and finance. So we have about 10,000 customers, a little more than 10,000 customers at Workday. We serve about 65 million users on the platform, interacting with about 625 billion transactions a year on the platform. So quite large scale. Again, many of the largest customers in the world run HR and finance on Workday. Given all the talk, obviously we're at the AI Summit here, some pretty interesting conversations going on so far. We wanted to talk a bit about responsible AI and our approach to it. And so that's what we're here to do today. So Kelly, would you mind introducing yourself a bit?
Absolutely. Hey, everybody. So glad to see you all. I'm Kelly Trindel, as Jim mentioned, and I'm our Chief Responsible AI Officer. And I just want to start out by saying, we really are excited about AI technology here at Workday. We think of it as one of these sort of transformational kind of moments, right? Like there was life before electricity and after electricity. It made a giant change in the way people live their lives. Same with internet, same with social media, mobile phones. I mean, can you remember life before a mobile phone? I don't know if you're like me, but sometimes I think, geez, I used to just go out and no one could get a hold of me until I went home, unless we ran into each other. So obviously it's really, all of these innovations have changed our lives. And we really see AI in the same way, potentially even more, altering than some of those other technologies that we talked about. And so, as Jim said, that makes it all the more important for us to make sure that we're thinking about developing this technology responsibly and ethically and in a trustworthy way. We expected this responsible innovation to be really designed into the tech.
Yeah, that's great. So before we really dive in, can you explain what you mean, what we mean when we're saying responsible AI?
Absolutely. So in case you haven't developed a responsible AI program at your company, or in case you're thinking about where you would start, I think the first place to start is just to think about the risks that could arise from these technologies when they meet a human being, right? And so I think the categories of risks, those could be like safety risks, risks to fundamental human rights. Those are the general categories, I think, where these fall. But I think it's a matter of thinking about the particular technology and the kind of risks that could arise from the use of that tech. And so the purpose of the program, the Responsible AI program for us at Workday, is to really try to build this risk identification and risk mitigation process into the development and the deployment of the tech.
And so we serve enterprise applications, right? We're serving B2B. Can you tell us why that matters in particular in the enterprise?
Yeah. I mean, first and foremost, it's just the right thing to do, right? Like, since this is such a transformative and powerful technology, it's just the right thing to do, to think about, like, where could it go wrong? How could it potentially impact people in a negative way? And trust has been built into Workday's approach to everything from day one. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is a practical approach, right? We understand as a B2B company, as you mentioned, that our customers are less likely to uptake the technology unless they trust it. And so even above and beyond the ethical and moral considerations, there's the practical concerns. If I was a customer of Workday, for example, I would have certain questions about how do you know, how do you test, how do you think about, how this tech could potentially have those kind of unintended consequences. And so it's a very practical matter, just above and beyond the moral and ethical concerns.
Yep.
And so I'm wondering, Jim, before we go any further, could you just talk about, our innovations in AI at Workday, so that as we move on, talk more about responsible AI, folks have a sense of what kind of innovations we're talking about?
Yeah, kind of the baseline grounding of it. So we've been at machine learning AI development for a decade now, a bit over that. We started our first formal responsible AI program in 2019, set out our first set of principles in 2019. So we've been at this for a while. Obviously, we're doing best effort around testing and making sure we're building things responsibly before that. But we really started to formalize that actually just before COVID. So we've been at this for a while, and we've taken a bit of a different approach in terms of how we build out machine learning technologies and AI. We built it directly into the core of the platform. And that gives us a few benefits. One, it makes it relatively easy to quickly proliferate those technologies and solutions across the full footprint of the application. But it also allows us to adopt net new technologies like generative AI really quickly, large language models in particular. It allows us to adopt those really fast and get those into the hands of users. So that's been a big advantage to us. But we've always been really focused on human-machine teaming and really elevating individuals, unlocking their potential in the work that they do. We've focused very deliberately on eliminating tedious work, allowing folks to focus on more strategic work, all while reducing the overall risk of running the business. And if you look at generative, maybe another example of that, if you look at generative in particular, we had our big user conference Rising in San Francisco a couple months ago, and again in Barcelona for our European customers. And we announced some of the things that we've been building through the course of the year around generative AI, things like creating job descriptions and analyzing contracts, things like that. They're always focused on really getting, call it 80% of the solution in the hands of the users, and then having a very deliberate user experience treatment over the top of that lets folks know they're interacting with a generated system. You need to go review it. You need to make sure that it's accurate, correct, before you hit submit, publish that out. So it's really, that's what we mean by that human-machine teaming element of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great.
So can you talk us through a bit how we have approached responsible AI and our program around it?
Absolutely. And if you don't mind in the audience, I'm just going to use a couple slides just to help organize the information. So at Workday, we think about responsible AI, and I think this is probably valuable for anybody who's trying to think about what a responsible AI program looks like. We think about our principles, which you've already mentioned that we first had in 2019. But then, principles are a starting point. They're a North Star. Where the rubber meets the road with principles is how we actually put them into practice, right? So then we have a set of practices that operationalize those principles. And then the third, important aspect of the program is the people that actually do the work. I just can't stress enough how important it is to have a diversity of viewpoints and levels of seniority across the org to come together and do this kind of work.
So maybe you can walk us through each of these?
Sure. So our principles, which we've already mentioned, as Jim mentioned, we've had AI ethics principles since 2019, but in 2022, just about a year ago, we came back together and said, is this still the right sort of North Star? Is this where we want to make sure that we're moving to with our AI developments? And so this is where we've landed on, again, what is our North Star? What are we striving for? What is our, almost like a mission statement? So number one, it's always humans first, right? Like you already mentioned, human-machine teaming. We're always thinking about ways to just amplify human potential. Like how do we put technologies into people's hands and make their work better? So it's always starting with that. Now, relatedly, we want to think about, most of what you'll hear me talking about going forward is this risk thing, the risk identification and risk mitigation. But it's important to always remember the excitement about this tech and how it can be developed to actually have a positive impact, positively impact society. So like you mentioned, for example, eliminating tedious work. That's the kind of thing that we're thinking about is just like, how can we actually put tech out there that has that kind of positive impact? And then when it comes to transparency and fairness, I just want to mention, like, people come to the responsible AI position or to the responsible AI work from different backgrounds. Some people come from privacy, some people come from engineering, et cetera. I came from civil rights. So I've been thinking about fairness and, anti-discrimination concerns for a really long time. I worked at the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission for many years, for example. And so I bring that perspective and that kind of care to the work. And so that sort of falls under the principle of champion transparency and fairness. And then finally, I just want to mention about privacy and data protection. I think we have a world-class privacy program at Workday. And so that's been a great help to me, frankly, to build on those learnings and the way that kind of risk-based approach from the privacy world, that's kind of, we built on top of that for the responsible AI program. So then I'm just going to move into practices.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. and just talk about, this is sort of, again, if you're thinking like, how do I get started on this? Or what does it mean for an enterprise B2B company to do responsible AI, risk identification and risk management? The first thing is, like, we can't boil the ocean, right? There's a lot to think about when it comes to responsible AI. And so, the first thing is, like, what do we want to focus on? What do we want to focus most of our attention on? And so we're thinking about the applications where the AI really gets uptaken by our customers. And when we think about those, we can identify, like, what is a sensitive use case for an AI technology? And so we think, for example, Workday does HR and financial management. And so a lot of our higher risk cases are in the HR space. And they're technologies that we've developed for our customers to utilize in what we think of as worker transitions. So things like hiring, promotion, termination, any kind of technology that we develop that could be used by our customers for those kind of use cases, those fall in our high risk category, or our sensitive use risk category. And it's very important to say, this doesn't mean they're bad. It just means we have to be a little bit more careful with developing those technologies. And so we've developed a set of responsible AI guidelines. And the idea with our high risk use cases is that all of those responsible AI guidelines must be documented before we turn out any new AI ML products in that high risk category. Now, so that really helps us in terms of prioritizing. Again, we can't boil the ocean, so where do we want to focus? And then there's a category of what we think of as like medium risk tier. So maybe it will potentially impact individuals' economic opportunities, but not immediately. And so those fall into that medium risk tier. And then we have a set of special guidelines just for those use cases. And so above and beyond, like, I'm talking mostly about what we call the context of the technology, but there's also characteristics of the technology which are important for risk tiering. And so, some of our Gen AI use cases, for example, might fall in the medium risk tier because it's a developing, emerging technology, and we have special guidelines for that kind of technology. And then there's a low risk category, and this is just important as the high risk category because we're really trying to balance innovation and integrity. Those are two core Workday values. And so we want to make sure we can move quickly with, innovation, particularly when it's in that low risk category. So the direction, if you will, from the RAI team to the development teams is, if you're in that low risk category, proceed. Once we move through we've identified it as a low risk technology, we want you to move forward, and we don't want to be too concerned about documenting all of these guidelines. And if you're wondering what a guideline is, I have a sample on the screen for you in the fairness category. So for those higher risk technologies, particularly the ones that are to be used by our customers for those worker transitions, we want to provide customers with an aggregate set of fairness test results for them to understand how did we think about fairness and how did we test it.
Yeah, and again, that comes back to demonstrating transparency and developing trust with the customers, right?
Absolutely, that's right. And speaking of transparency and disclosure, so above and beyond fairness, I was talking about fairness as a responsible AI guideline. It's not, all of responsible AI, even though I have a civil rights background, all of responsible AI isn't just about fairness and bias, right? There's all of these different categories. And so we look at things like human oversight, for example. Like, it goes back to that #1 principle that we talked about, amplify human potential. Particularly for the higher risk use cases, we want to make sure we're very careful that things aren't overly automated, right? And that we've got human oversight built straight into the technology. Now, that's the case for most, if not all, of our tech, but we make sure we document how it works, particularly for those higher risk use cases. And then, areas like accuracy, reliability, robustness, those are very important as well for responsible AI. Like, does the tech work the way we say that it works? We can look at that in terms of our accuracy metrics, reliability metrics, et cetera. And then you mentioned, transparency, so important. And again, particularly important for those higher risk use cases.
Yep, that's great. So again, for those who are thinking about getting started, trying to figure out how to implement something similar within the walls of their own business, can you talk through how we've approached the structure of the team, the people side of it?
Absolutely. Again, the people is really important. The people side of it is very important. So I have a dedicated team that I'm very proud of, a responsible AI team at Workday. Small but mighty, and it's a group of social scientists and data scientists, technology experts, and we're just adding on engineering expertise directly onto the team now. In fact, it's really exciting. We have somebody starting on Monday who's got that PhD background in engineering, and we're really glad to bring that onto the team. But even if I had the best team in the world of responsible AI governance folks, it wouldn't be enough. Like, we really need input from across the org, from all different seniority levels, from all different backgrounds. And so folks like from our belonging and diversity organization, from our UX design organization, like nobody on the team is an expert in UX design, and that's a really important part of the process, right? Product management, of course, AI engineering, legal and compliance. It's one of the great benefits of doing this work is I get to learn from people who have such a different perspective than me and who have such different expertise than I do. And one of the really great strengths about the program at Workday, and I'm talking about that because that's what I know, but I hope it's generalizable to you at your different companies, is that we have a dedication all the way from the top of leadership at the company, right? Like, yep. Jim, you're on our Responsible AI Advisory Board,
I am.
Which meets monthly. And the Responsible AI Advisory Board, gives us guidance and gives us expert input, and also gives us approval for all the different governance, processes, like that risk eval I mentioned and the guidelines. Our advisory board has reviewed all of that, given us input. We've iterated before we've put it out. And that's really important for folks at lower seniority levels to understand. People really care about it. It's not just lip service. So I would recommend that as really important, if you're thinking about a responsible AI program at your company. And one more thing I want to mention, there's that seniority level, there's the dedicated team, and then we have a network of what we call responsible AI champions. So we used to call folks like this like boots on the ground, but now I like to say hands on keyboards. The people who actually develop the technology, like who really know how it works, who really understand the roadmap, where do we want to go. We need them giving input to all of our governance, letting us know, does this make sense? Does this work? And we're constantly iterating. We're iterating right now. I just had a meeting before I headed over to New York from California about, this guideline, the way we've been putting it in place. It just doesn't quite make sense for like what we're doing. So can we iterate a little bit in terms of how we put this into practice? And we really need that kind of input and that kind of, guidelines, guidance from folks around the org to help us make sure that what we're putting into place, again, is not just from that like moral and ethical perspective, but from a practical perspective. Because one thing I'm not interested in doing is just like pontificating. There's enough pontification, I think, out there. Like, I really want to make this work. Like, what can we do to make it work? Where's the solution? How do we move it forward, right?
Yeah, that's great. And I think from my perspective, a couple of the big strengths you highlighted are the diversity of that team, particularly the RAI board. It's really representative of almost the entire company, not quite, but very close to the entire company and the different viewpoints and backgrounds that all that brings. That's really important, really rich in how that board is able to operate. But the other piece that you mentioned is we didn't try to boil the ocean. We didn't try to solve all of it all at once. We started relatively small, and we're iterating and moving fast because we don't get it all right at the beginning. And so that ongoing cadence of iteration, I think, is super important for us.
Yeah, agreed. And that reminds me just to mention the importance of, those folks coming together. Like, Jim, you're an important participant on the board as our Chief Technology Officer. Our Chief Legal Officer chairs the board. We have our Chief Diversity Officer who participates. We have our VP Public Policy who's on the board as well. And all of these different perspectives, so important. I mean, speaking of public policy, right? Like, there's so much developing. I don't know if this is your first time coming to an AI conference, maybe you haven't heard about all the developing regulation, but I assume this is not your first time. There's so much going on in the world of regulation, right? Yep. And I wonder, what do you think, Jim, about regulation? Do you think it'll be a good thing for the space, or do you think it could hinder us?
I think it's both. It definitely could hinder it done wrong, but I believe, and Workday as a whole believes, we need regulation in this space, particularly in the enterprise. To protect individuals, make sure that the technology is used in a way that is safe for individuals and has that human-centric approach to it. it certainly could be over legislated and restrictive and add unnecessary cost and time to development, but I think there's a balance that can be found there, and we've been influential in trying to shape the trying to shape the legislation towards what we believe helps find that balance, allowing us to innovate, move fast, but also while protecting individuals. I keep saying it, but I do think there's a good balance that can be done there. And in the meantime, we're putting practices in place that we think target where we think that legislation will be. It'll be we were talking about this earlier, you mentioned it, you don't want to wait for the legislation to be in place and then start building that program out. You got to start now. You have to be doing it responsibly today in your development, and it's just going to be tough to catch up if you're trying to retrofit that back into your own processes later.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely true.
So for folks that are looking at implementing some kind of program like this, can you help us understand, there's sometimes a bit of confusion about who's responsible for the responsibility of it. Like what's the shared level of responsibility between developers and customers in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. And this really dovetails nicely off the regulation discussion. Some of the smarter regulation that I think we've seen coming has really indicated what is the role of the developer of the technology and what is the role of the deployer of the tech. So for those of you who have familiarity with a privacy background, you might think of the controller processor distinction and the regulations around that, particularly in GDPR. In the AI reg space, the terminology is starting to look like developer and deployer. And we have different roles to play. This is important, and frankly, I didn't understand it as much until I came to work at Workday, being, a developer, a B2B player in the space. So I think, basically, to answer your question, it's got to be a shared responsibility.
Yep.
Ecosystem. What is the role that the developer can play? What is the role that the deployer who actually has access to end users can play? And how do we make sure that we're very transparent with each other so that we understand, the different roles? And, not only do we have different access to end users and sort of different roles to play, but we may have different principles, different practices, different risk tolerances, right? And so it seems to me like the key is very much understanding that, there are these different roles supporting that kind of smart regulation that will make it very clear what is required. There's a bill, for example, in California that I've seen that really spells out, a developer could run what they call an AI impact assessment and provide this information to the deployer, and then the deployer could run their own AI impact assessment for their role in the ecosystem. And so, to your point, that kind of smart regulation is really helpful.
Yeah, and for us, how we operate as a business, it's really a partnership between ourselves and our customers, as you said, and privacy did lead actually security first and privacy second. Led the way in terms of how we communicate that, how we talk with our customers, and have this shared partnership. So that, as you said, different businesses and different industries in particular are going to have different levels of regulations and risk tolerance and all of that. So making it an ongoing part of the conversation or our relationship with our customers is super important.
Yeah.
So the space is changing a lot, obviously. We've talked about some of those changes, talked about some of the regulatory new work that's coming out. Are there resources you would recommend for folks to go do further research and maybe help them get started?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much out there, like I mentioned, and it can seem daunting. It can seem overwhelming. Geez, this bill in Chicago says something different than this law that just passed in New York City. Or this bill in California looks different than, whatever's coming out at a federal level. But I find that, these are sort of the top three things that we're looking at right now. And frankly, as I onboard new members of my team, I'm asking them to review, these documents and understand what they say. So for example, the NIST AI Risk Management Framework has been very valuable to us as we're building out the program. Yep. All of those responsible AI guidelines that you saw, those categories that I showed you a little while ago, those all came from, pretty much from the NIST AI Risk Management Framework. Okay, NIST talks about map, measure, manage, govern. It's 3 M's and a G. I don't know why they didn't just do 4 M's, but that kind of like, how do you map the risk? How do you measure the risk? How do you mitigate the risk? And then the whole thing is about governance, right? So that's incredibly helpful for like standing up a program like this, yeah. And then, I can't not mention the EU AI Act. Of course, this hasn't passed into law yet. There's a lot going on with the EU AI Act right now. In fact, I'm taking a red eye home tonight to California because I have some meetings tomorrow in the office, and one of them was supposed to be on the EU AI Act. And just as we were walking out, I saw a meeting canceled because there's still negotiation going on, and the public policy team can't give us the direct guidance to what's coming out of EU. But that's okay. Even just the the version that's out there right now, actually, there's a part of that called Annex 3 in the back that talks about risk, tiering. Like I talked before about a core aspect of our program is, identifying where should we be spending more time thinking about sensitive use cases and high risk use cases. And EU has been incredibly helpful with that. Even in the HR space, not everything is the same risk level. Like I mentioned worker transitions, there's a lot of HR technology with AI in it that doesn't affect worker transitions. So even and I know I'm talking about, your area may or may not be the same as mine, but it's a really useful, that aspect of EU to look at it and think, okay, so for these higher risk, more sensitive use cases, these are the kind of things they would want to see us do. It's called a conformity assessment in EU language. And so these are the kind of things they would want to see us do for those higher risk, tier applications. And so that's been incredibly valuable. And then, much more recently, there's the Biden-Harris administration put out the executive order in terms of where they, expect to see regulation developing in the US. And, that looks very positive to us at Workday. It seems like that whole risk-based approach is being echoed by our federal administration.
Yeah, so it feels like it's starting to kind of congeal around a set of principles and practices that we can put in place.
Yeah.
It's great to see.
Yeah, I like gel and congeal. I've been asked several times, what do you see as the big differences between these different regulations that are coming out? And maybe it's the practical person in me or the applied person in me, but my answer is I'd rather look at the similarities because that's how you move forward. Okay, what can I learn, from all of these different resources? So
yeah, and that was true with GDPR and privacy regulation preceding all this. So any final thoughts you want to leave with the audience?
Yeah, there's so many, and I see we have we're ticking down, but I guess I'll go back to where we started. The technology is really exciting, right?
Yeah.
And there's no reason to not be excited about it. And we can do this. We can do this. We can put responsible AI governance in place that will, protect against or mitigate against these risks to safety and fundamental human rights. And so it's a great, exciting time to be doing this work. And you learn so much again from the different people that you're interacting with, and yeah, it's just I'm just very excited about the future. Count me as excited.
Yeah, that's great. And I might just add for those in the audience, if you haven't already, get started. Take a look at the resources that Kelly mentioned earlier, and start small, get going. You don't have to solve it all at once, but get moving. All right. Well, thank you, Kelly. It was a great conversation and hopefully valuable to the audience. Thanks you all for being here, and have a great rest of the show.